morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. This morning, we're talking about the state budget and its intersection with federal funding chaos and changes. Governor Ned Lamont introduced his more than $55 billion two-year budget proposal this week, highlighting funding for education, housing, and health care. But he also opened up the session to a big debate about the fiscal guardrails and if a budget can even get done in time. Let's take a closer look.
Our proposed budget is our best effort to stay true to our Connecticut values.
Wednesday, Governor Lamont laid out those values in his 2026-2027 spending proposal. Some feel the cautious budget doesn't reflect their needs, though. The governor's two-year plan would spend nearly $27 billion next fiscal year, with just over $28 billion in the second. The back and forth between spending more or spending less is only made more complicated by the fact this budget process, those pandemic-era federal dollars are gone. Hardest hit by that new gap, education. Lamont's proposal includes a $54 million increase in state aid for special ed and a $300 million investment toward future universal pre-K.
And any surplus in the general fund, estimated at $300 million per year, will be deposited into our brand new universal preschool endowment. A universal preschool endowment.
Higher ed, from UConn to Connecticut State, have warned tuition increases, class cuts, and more could be on the table in the next few years. All of those institutions facing budget shortfalls and asking the state to make up for it. But lawmakers are sticking to their message from last budget session, saying they can't make up for federal funds and never plan to.
It was very clear how those dollars were supposed to be spent.
Those dollars should have been used for one-time expenditures.
Now you can come to us and ask us for more money, but the bottom line is there's more demand than we have revenue for at this point.
Lawmakers seem likely to go with Lamont's plan, which offers more dollars in state grants to higher ed, but without those ARPA funds schools got used to, it will still feel like a cut.
UConn students are going to be important, and they need to be considered. We are your constituents. Really, every resource that serves students on campus feels a pinch when we enroll more and don't get more funding.
When we have budget cuts, it impacts the number of classes that are able to be offered, which can impact how quickly students are able to achieve their dreams of getting their degree.
Other groups let down nonprofits, which say without federal funding or any meaningful increase in already slowed state money, they're looking at a $19 million cut. That's on top of the funding shortage they've protested for years. Even pre-pandemic, needs and client wait lists were growing. Homeless services are also disappointed by the limited funding put forward. The state's unhoused population has increased for the third year in a row. Shelters overcrowded and nonprofits unable to keep up. The governor did suggest putting extra aside, especially for cold weather emergency services, but many feel it just isn't enough. The governor's proposal did make room for more funding for home ownership and housing development. Lamont is hoping $100 million will be put into the state's Time to Own program, which offers forgivable loans for first-time home buyers. Of course, you can't own a home unless there are homes to own. The state wants to focus on supply, $350 million suggested for development support each year. But a battle is already shaping up over state involvement and local zoning policy.
The feds are pulling back on rent support, and at the same time, strong demand and little inventory here in Connecticut are driving up housing prices, driving up rents, and driving up homelessness. People want to be in Connecticut, people want to move to Connecticut, and the only thing slowing us down is a lack of housing.
Hospitals aren't happy either. The Connecticut Hospital Association calls this budget devastating. It says the policies will add significant financial burdens on local hospitals at a time when they are already struggling. The biggest concern starting to solve the Medicaid reimbursement crisis. Plans only cover cents on the dollar of services, not paying hospitals enough, leaving them even more in the red. Many doctors now won't see low-income patients simply because they can't afford to. lawmakers weren't able to cover more of Medicaid last year, but promised it would be one of their own budget priorities this year. In a bit of a shock, Lamont proposed just $71 million, nowhere close to the number lawmakers are actually looking at, and not enough to start solving things for hospitals. Lamont did propose lowering prescription drug costs by limiting price increases for generic drugs to the annual rate of inflation. He wants the legislature to give government officials the authority to enforce that and fine manufacturers raising prices. Lamont also, once again, asked the state budget to allow shopping outside the domestic market.
And our budget includes funding to import pharmaceuticals from Canada at less cost, unless tariffs kill that option.
That call out of the current administration was not the only time Lamont shared criticism of D.C. in his budget address.
Every day we get another curveball from Washington.
State Democrats shared his concerns, saying confusion and uncertainty from the feds will impact Connecticut's ability to craft a budget.
We may not know by the end of our session. We may not have all the federal information that we will need to pass a final budget. But until that time, we have to go forward with our normal process.
Beyond issues over Capitol Hill cash flow, there's disagreement on a state level over those fiscal guardrails.
$3 billion in increased spending, blowing past the guardrails, playing fiscal gimmicks, creating slush funds, no relief on energy, no relief on taxes.
Governor Lamont proposed very modest tax cuts, mostly tweaking thresholds for a small state tax credit toward your local property taxes. This compared to a much larger cut last budget process in 2023. We do have that surplus tucked away and growing, which some people say the state shouldn't be afraid to touch, especially if it would mean lowering taxes. There is some interest the state made on those pandemic-era ARPA dollars as well. Despite all that in the bank, lawmakers and Lamont alike are still worried about revenue, warning harder times could come again. That search for even more money for the state coming in the form of potentially bad news for commuters who make up so much of our population. Lamont suggested increases to rail rates and bus fares, other small ways to make sure cash is still flowing to the state capital. Not just because of concerns for the economy, but because of fears around federal funding freezes. The state would have to scramble to make up that gap.
He really hasn't solved any problems in this budget. Hospitals aren't going to be happy. Our towns aren't going to be happy. He has just spread money around. Our nonprofits are not going to be happy with this budget. And I think that we're going to have a lot of work to do to try to fix this.
With so much up in the air, some did feel the governor's proposal is still a good starting point.
We don't know to the extent of the federal tsunami that we are facing. But what the governor has said as a snapshot in time is a reasonable beginning.
They're going to present it to the public, listen to the public, and then the legislature will present their budget back, their proposal, and then we'll negotiate. But we have a place to start, and that's a good thing.
And this is just a starting point for the budget process. Now the legislature is tasked with crafting their possible proposal, which could look quite different from Governor Lamont's based on current chamber conversations. The goal is still to pass a budget by the end of session in June. There's even more within the governor's proposal, though, from funding for police to quantum computing AI support. We have all that and more online and on our Fox 61 News app, along with the entire proposal linked there.